What is up, everybody? I'm No Lux Given here with your afternoon snap, and today's video is just going to be me talking to the camera here. That's why I've got Lily right by my side as some other additional content to look at, but no gameplay footage in this one because we're going to be talking about the newest location added into Marvel Snap, which I think is a big one. So I wanted to put out this video to release as the location comes out, because I think that this is going to be the most impactful location that has been released yet into Marvel Snap, and in this video, I'm gonna talk about why. I'll throw the location up on the screen here right above Lily. That's not gonna block her. Mount Vesuvius, players can't retreat after turn 5. That's the text, that's the location, that's the tweet. This is really incredible text, in my opinion, and in some ways, it is the least impactful location to ever be added to the game because it is not going to change who wins the game. It's not going to change which synergies work with it, which cards can get played there. But at the same time, it changes the fundamentals of the game. And it's basically akin to Limbo or TVA, I would say. Limbo making the game into 7 turns, maybe I'll throw these up on the screen in editing, and TVA making it a 4-turn game. And the reason that I say that is because in games with Mount Vesuvius, it will essentially make the games 5-turn games, because on turn 5, you're gonna either have the option to retreat as your last possible time to retreat, or you're locking it in. You're saying, no, we're gonna stay in it and play this one to its conclusion, be it 6 turns or 7 turns in games featuring both Mount Vesuvius and Limbo, which those games are definitely going to happen. So the turn 5 essentially becomes that of the turn 6. It is your last opportunity to retreat. And I want you to think of turn 5 with Mount Vesuvius essentially being the same as turn 6 in a game with Dark Dimension in it, because you're gonna do turn 6 and then another turn is going to happen, more things are going to get revealed and players have opportunities to play into that and what have you, but there's no additional opportunity to respond to what's going on that final end game portion. So that is why I think Mount Vesuvius basically is a way to make 5-turn games possible in Marvel Snap, which is just huge, but it does it in a very, very interesting way that messes with the snap mechanic. Mount Vesuvius in your game essentially adds the turn 6 snap as a really weird feature in the game. Typically, snapping on turn 6 is something that is seldom done. It's used in cases where, like, the game is like either hyper close or you want to potentially bluff on the final turn, or sometimes like counter bluff, pretend that you're bluffing. I've done that before. Maybe I'll include a clip here. Probably not. I'll probably forget to, but most of the time in a game of Marvel Snap, if you snap on turn 6, your opponent then knows what's up and they can retreat accordingly. So snapping on turn 6 will often actually result in less cubes than if you just haven't snapped. And there's mind games in there, obviously, with the bluff and the counter bluff, as I brought up. But for that reason, turn 6 snapping just isn't a huge part of the game. I don't know if I should move the camera down so that you can see Lily a little bit better as she just gets comfortable here. But Mount Vesuvius now adds the turn 6, the potential to turn 6 snap into the game. And if we use my previous example, it's akin to being able to snap after turn 6 but before Dream Dimension or Dark Dimension. I might have said Dream Dimension earlier, before Dark Dimension is revealed. So if you think about how interesting that would be as an impact onto the game, I think Mount Vesuvius is a similar impact to that. And this is going to need to be taken into account on turn 5 in every game with Mount Vesuvius. You can either retreat for 1 cube, or you can stay in it for 4 or 8 cubes. Most of the time, when you are playing a Mount Vesuvius game. That's why it's going to feel a little bit different than TVA and Limbo, and why I think that it stands out from those other two locations with its additional impact from the snap element is, I mean, imagine Limbo, but you can't retreat on turn 7. That's a totally different game. So Mount Vesuvius, either you're going to wind up retreating for 1, sometimes retreating for 2. Like, there's still, if you were snapping for 1 and 2 previously, there's still very good reasons to snap on turns 1 and turn 2 of the game, and even turn 3 and turn 4. Like, snapping early is still very good, because then on turn 5, when your opponent retreats, they're potentially retreating for 2. But now, if you decide to stay in it even for 1 on turn 5 in a Mount Vesuvius game, you're often going to find yourself playing for 4 or potentially 8 cubes. And that's something you got to be aware of, and something that your opponents might not also be aware of as well. So there's like some weird incentives here. While I do think that against a seasoned player, snapping early, putting that pressure on is generally pretty good. Making them retreat on turn 5 for 2 cubes is still going to be the way to go in most games, in tournaments and in conquest mode. However, there's something to be said for not snapping at all, hoping your opponent kind of lets their guard down. Now I'm thinking of Snow Guard and end puns, which I'm gonna get to Snow Guard in just a second, don't worry. Hoping that your opponent lets their guard down enough that they don't think about the fact that they're actually about to play a 4-cube game. Lull them into thinking it's a 1-cube game by not snapping, and then you enter into that 6th and final turn. You just snap and take them for 4 cubes. So I think that both of those are ways to play it. There's a little bit of recognizing what you are playing and where. Bots, I'm not sure if bots are going to understand what's going on with Mount Vesuvius, so I think that climbing is going to be a heck of a lot easier, almost a hell of a lot easier. We'll get to hella soon as well, but climbing's going to be a lot easier potentially with Mount Vesuvius, as you can just get more free cubes from bots, which now can no longer retreat against you. So all of that, I think, is going to have a really huge impact once we see Mount Vesuvius added. Now, the other thing with Mount Vesuvius to consider is going to be any type of location manipulation. And while I typically hate any type of location manipulation, I'm talking Storm, I'm talking Scarlet Witch, Reality Stone, newer ones being Limbo, which feels like a brand new card, Snow Guard, and Legion. Though Legion's kind of in a league of its own, and they're all kind of interesting. And then you also have what else do we have? The 3/3 that turns it into Ruins Rhino, right? I think that that's most of them. I'm leaving out one in particular right now, but if I forgot any others, I'm sure you'll remind me in the comments. But these cards provide an additional incentive today, but then also just they're going to have more utility in general in Marvel Snap. These cards are great answers typically to TVA. They're a great way to flip the game in the case of Limbo, and Mount Vesuvius is going to be no different. If you have control over whether Mount Vesuvius is working or not, it's not even just the ability to turn it off, it's the choice. It's the ability to do so. Not that you have to, but that you could, and that the decision is yours. And that's going to be really important. That's the reason I said that Legion is a little bit awkward. And I have more to say on, well, actually, no, I don't really have any more to say on Legion. That's basically all I wanted to say for location manipulation. These effects are already really, really strong, both right now in the current metagame and just in general in Marvel Snap, and I think that Mount Vesuvius just gives you an additional reason to make sure you're playing at least one of these cards in your deck. And speaking of location manipulation, the other one that I said I was saving and that you might not even initially think of as location manipulation is Galactus. Galactus is seeing a lot more play right now because Alioth was the most recently added card to the game, and there's some synergies there. They play a lot of similar cards and attack from different angles that make them both interesting choices and an interesting kind of like a, I don't want to call it synergy because that's not what it is, though it can be sometimes. Yeah, no, it is synergy. If there's only one location, right, Alioth is obviously synergistic with that. But regardless, people are playing a lot more Galactus right now. I think this location is good with, so there's two things about it. One is that you can use Galactus to destroy Mount Vesuvius, but it's really not what you're going for here. It's actually the opposite. It's a little bit about what I talked about, that turn 6 snapping is now possible, and Galactus decks classically are give me 1 cube, give me 1 cube, give me 1 cube, lose 4 cubes, and climbing very slowly with them. Well, now with Mount Vesuvius, you have a way to get some additional cubes out of your Galactus play in a way that I think is pretty important for the deck. And the other thing that makes this location really important is there's no restrictions on it. Like I brought up earlier, it's a very boring vanilla location, which is great for Galactus. That's exactly what Galactus wants. He doesn't want to mess around with anything funky. There's, can I play Galactus there? Yes or no? And the answer for Mount Vesuvius is yes, which is great. And even if you don't wind up playing Galactus to this location, like say you have the big house as one of your locations in the game. Or no, what's the other one? What's the opposite of the big house? Maybe I'll throw it up on the screen here if I remember. I'm snapping as an editing cue for myself. The one that says you can't play 1, 2, or 3 cost cards there. Well, if you have that in your game, then you can wave into Mount Vesuvius and Galactus into that location. And the reason that that is great is just more open locations. Like if you have a game with big house, the opposite big house, and Serra Sanctorum, well then you're fine. You can wave in one location, Galactus in the other. But if you have a location that's like deep space, Sanctum Sanctorum, and the big house location that I was talking about, then you won't, even though you can play Galactus at one of those locations, you can't play Wave at any of those locations. So this is just like a location to play Galactus, a location to play Wave, and while that's like a small thing, they're kind of trying to move away from locations with restrictions. As a former Galactus one-trick, I will tell you that those things are very, very important to Galactus's success. And that brings me to the next category of cards that I wanted to talk about, which is did I draw it style decks. And these decks awkwardly have been on the rise since the release of Loki last week. And Mount Vesuvius is kind of going to take them down a peg, in my opinion. I'm talking here about Hela and Cerebro, and there's probably some other examples, but these two are cards that you build your entire deck around. You change basically every card that you're willing to put in your deck, because when you draw this specific card, you can flip the paradigm of how all of these other cards function in your deck. And Mr. Negative is kind of similar, but kind of different in a very important way. You want to draw Mr. Negative and play it on turn 3, sometimes turn 4. These cards, you just want to draw them by turn 6. You actually, in the case of Hela, sometimes don't even want to draw it before turn 5. But you're looking to draw these cards and play them on turn 6 and sometimes turn 7 of the game. And where that's awkward with Mount Vesuvius here, you might not have drawn it yet. You might not know if you're going to draw Cerebro or Hela. And you are then going to have to make the choice on turn 5. Do I think I'm going to draw it? And if you don't think you are, I mean, it's going to depend if it's a limbo game, right? Though I think that these decks will potentially use limbo, use magic into Mount Vesuvius just to get rid of the location, because I think that this location is actually that awkward for these decks. because you can no longer take the gamble of going to turn 6 to see if you find the important card. So I think that makes these decks a little bit more dangerous to play, and one thing that gets awkward with them too, I brought up that previously, like, now we have the ability to snap on turn 6, and while that's true, we no longer have the ability to snap on turn 6 in Mount Vesuvius games as a bluff. And why that's important is because a previous great playline of a Hela deck, turn 2 Invisible Woman, turn 5 Modok into Invisible Woman, turn 6 you didn't draw Hela, snap, see if your opponent will think that you have it and retreat accordingly. Now you can't do that, because now if you snap, you're just playing the game for additional cubes. Your opponent cannot retreat, so there's no sense in bluffing that you have something. So these decks become a little bit more dangerous because you can't bluff, and because if you don't draw it, then you're just stuck playing the game for either 2 cubes or 4 cubes, and there's nothing that you can really do about it, and your opponent is probably going to take you for 4 cubes in that instance, but I'll talk more about that at the end of this video. On the other side of single card, did I draw it style combo decks, we have America Chavez. I just wanted to touch on that briefly here. It's like the opposite end of that. Being able to know your output of turn 6 by turn 5, I think is going to be a super important thing. I think that's always an important thing in Marvel Snap, and that is part of the strength of players being able to recognize power output on turn 4, on turn 3, on turn 2. You'll see me often talking about like Zabu decks just snapping on turn 2 if you have the Zabu. Loki decks becomes very obvious to snap if you have the Quinjet Loki. So things like that, just being able to recognize your power output earlier is going to allow you to win more games, because you can recognize on turn 5 before you enter the Mount Vesuvius turn what your power output is going to be. And cards like, well, not really cards like, just America Chavez is going to be able to help you with that. So wanted to talk on America just for the value of consistency there, but I also wanted to bring up the value of surprise. There's a few cards that you can play on turn 5 that are going to completely shift the paradigm of the game, because they change what plays your opponent has access to. I think the biggest one is going to be Wave. I'll include Sandman in that category as well, but there's some other things. Professor X to shut down locations I think can be really good, as well as Wong. Setting things up with Wong are sometimes awkward because you make like super telegraphed plays, right? Like imagine a deck that goes turn 4 Wong, turn 5 Mystique. That deck is going to do something on turn 6. And while that's a little bit of like a turn 4 setup, and the game's a little bit awkward sometimes because the more you telegraph something, then the more your opponent will have the opportunity to react to it with tech cards potentially. But tech cards aside, I think that like something like Wong on turn 5 allows you to do some setup while not giving your opponent really any opportunity to interact with that, and that's why it's good. Some other options that do require ramping into them, but could also be good. I brought up Black Panther. Galactus does kind of fit this category though in a weird way because it's also location manipulation, and something like Leader plays with like Odin and Leader on the final turns of the game, or Odining your wave, different stuff like that that give your opponent, like in those games, some of those setups are like easy retreats on turn 6. Once you have seen that deck do what it can do before, you kind of know what's coming and you know to get out of there. Well, if you can surprise your opponent by dropping that key card on turn 5, that is that huge setup. I think Professor X is like a great example here, because Professor X comes at like an awkward point sometimes, because if you snap before the Professor X, sometimes you give it away, sometimes your opponent can't play around it regardless, so it's fine. I'm talking about a Daredevil-less Professor X though. Daredevil could work here too, yeah, sure, why not? Daredevil, Professor X. If you were able to get down the Professor X though and actually lock your opponent out of a location, Jeff the Baby Landshark notwithstanding, then on the final turn of the game you get to snap, you know where your opponent can play to, and you just have a much easier time navigating that. So I think that those are all really great options. Typically, I would put Legion in this category. That's why I said I was going to bring up Legion again. It is a turn 5 play that can shift the paradigm of games, though the way that it does that by like switching the game to all Luxbar or Vormir or Death's Domain, those aren't going to work because those are going to get rid of Mount Vesuvius. So Legion doesn't quite fit this category. There is another like step to this as well, and that is because I am essentially saying that this is a 5-turn game, and typically turn 6 is when you are best surprising your opponent with your power output. That's why we've seen Serra be so powerful. That's why we've seen a bunch of other effects that I'm about to talk about right now, which is tech cards. Being able to play a tech card on the final turn of the game leaves your opponent no opportunity to react to it. Part of that reaction would be retreating. And in that way with Mount Vesuvius, playing cards like Shadow King or Enchantress or Shang-Chi are going to be less useful as turn 6 surprises and potentially more useful as turn 5 surprises. That also frees you up to play those powerful tech cards on turn 5, and then turn 6 follow that up with like a leader or just another powerful 6-cost card. So I think that Mount Vesuvius opens up those things as well. Here's the last discussion point of the video, and I'm putting this last partially because I don't want to draw too much attention to it. I think that this is a little bit awkward, and honestly, I would love to revisit this video in 2-3 months. Honestly, probably later than that, maybe 6-9 months, and not have this be a relevant part of the game anymore. But it is, and that is the turn timer. It's awkward, but utilizing the turn timer is potentially going to be more important in Mount Vesuvius games because we don't have the snap to communicate with our opponent. One of the ways that we do communicate to our opponent is with the turn timer, and we do still have the snap to communicate with our opponent, and that's part of the awkwardness here. So on the final turn of the game, let's say nobody has snapped, right? We're playing a 1-cube game and then it says final 2. Somebody should be snapping. One of those 2 players is going to win the game and should snap and make it a 4-cube game. The question is who? You kind of have to evaluate your hand. If it's a strong hand, snap, but hold on with me for 1 second. If it's a weak hand, don't snap. Okay? If it's a weak hand, don't snap. Well, what happens if my opponent didn't snap? Does that mean that they have a weak hand? Does that mean that if I wait and don't hit the end turn button and my opponent never snaps, we let the turn timer run all the way down, if they never snap, does that mean they have a weak hand and then I should be snapping if I have a medium hand? Probably. And so the correct play in these situations, and I'll throw in some air quotes there, correct play is going to be to not snap, run the turn timer, see if your opponent has any opinions on their hand. If they snap accordingly, And that's just more information. That's just more information that you can take in before you decide to snap yourself. It also means that by not snapping and waiting the full time, you present a weaker hand to your opponent, and that can be used as a sort of bluff as well. You don't snap, you let the turn timer run all the way down, they let the turn timer run all the way down, they snap because they think you have a weak hand, and then you counter snap, take them for 8 cubes. These are things that are unfortunately part of the game, even though they do add artificially, awkwardly a lot of time to it. I would love to see a mechanic in the future where snapping resets plays, resets the turn timer, and allows players to reevaluate their decision. Unfortunately, that adds even more time to the game and is kind of awkward for that reason. But this is awkward too. Hopefully it doesn't have a huge impact on Mount Vesuvius, but it's definitely something to be aware of. Evaluating your opponent's position, evaluating your own, and thinking about how they are evaluating their position and your position through the use of the snap, since there's no snap retreat and there's going to be a lot more turn 6 snaps. So hopefully that all made sense as far as a concept to think about, and hopefully we don't have to think about it in a year from now. But for today, that's going to be it for me. Thank you guys very much for watching. I'm No Lux Given. Peace.